Okay, I hope everybody had a good break, a little bit more time today than yesterday. So I'm looking forward to our next panel. And it's my pleasure to hand over to Gabor Toth. Just one thing before he introduces himself a little bit more. He will be a fellow, our postdoc fellow, actually the first postdoc fellow in this regard in digital studies next year, next calendar year. Right, so that's my special pleasure because that's a new thing, and I hope we can. That's the first time that we have this postdoc fellowship, and I hope that we may also can extend this to later years. But that's not really, let's say, done and decided yet. But I hope he makes a good presence so that we get a good support.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Gabor Toth. I'm a postdoctoral associate at Yale University. And my own field of research is the application of text and data mining for humanities. And at the moment, with the Fortune of Archive and with the Digital Humanities Lab at Yale, we are building a digital edition of testimonies and an exploratory tool to study them. So in our panel, we have three very exciting talks given by Paris, Papamichos, Chronakis, Andrew Curtis, and Eric Le Bourhis. So our first speaker is Paris Papamichos Chronakis, who arrived here from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Paris is a social and economic historian. His research investigates the transition of the Eastern Mediterranean port cities from empire to nation state. He has also contributed to the digital study of the Holocaust. With Georgios Antonio, he has been developing digital tools to map social networks during the Holocaust. Further to this, he was a member of the scientific committee developing the database of Greek Holocaust survivors' testimonies. And finally, his publications cover a great variety of areas, ranging from Greco-Jewish relations with Greek Zionism and the Holocaust of Greek Jewry. So, welcome.
Thank you very much to all. Particular thanks to the organizing and scientific committee, and most of all to Marika and Martha for taking such good care of all of us. It's a great pleasure to be back in LA. Yeah. Truly kudos. It's a great pleasure to be back in LA. I mean, there is a heat wave, but compared to Greece, this is a breeze. So, I'll be slightly blunt, slightly polemic, so this is kind of a spoiler alert, but I would welcome any kind of scathing criticism. So, since the early 1980s, the image of a survivor bearing witness on camera has been so inextricably linked to the audiovisual archive that it has become difficult to imagine any other way of capturing the experience of the Holocaust. The personal interview has supported the emergence and consolidation of a powerful conceptual framework organized around the key notions of witness, testimony, survival, trauma, truth, and memory. It has also generated a sustained discussion on issues of representation, as numerous studies have questioned the realism of the audiovisual interview, highlighted its performative and dialogic aspects, foregrounded the relation between the verbal and the non-verbal, pointed to the role of the camera in blurring the distinction between form and content, as well as in creating second and third-time witnesses, and dissected the manifold narrative arcs the interview follows from the aporetic to the redemptive. Today, Holocaust-related audiovisual archives continue to animate a lively discussion on the elusive essence of the digital archive, its relation to past archival regimes, its non-material nature, and its multiple and often contradictory functions as a site and a form of knowledge production and consumption. When it comes to testimonies, Holocaust audiovisual archives have become the new archival norm. According to Maria Ecker, Out of the circa 40,000 survivor testimonies recorded in America, only 13% were collected before 1978, compared to 87% after 1978, organized into no fewer than 69 archival collections. The sheer size of USC SOA Foundation's Visual History Archive and the further addition of audiovisual testimonies pertaining to other pre- and post-Holocaust genocides is turning the Holocaust testimony into a canon, albeit one, as Noah Schenker has shown, that can be turned against its own logic. Now, precisely because the Holocaust Audiovisual Archive nowadays holds the highest status of a model to be either explicitly copied or implicitly challenged, it is perhaps not far-fetched to argue that it has now created its own regime of truth. In particular, its fundamental organizing premise, the personal interview, has become as self-evident as to pass unnoticed. Indeed, the personal interview shapes, I argue, our conceptual framework. It turns the interviewee into a witness, the interviewer into a second witness, and the viewer into humanity. It transforms the interviewee's account into a testimony, a representation in crisis. The personal interview constitutes the nucleus of the audiovisual archive, and as such, it also determines its serial logic. Data collection rests on a series of successive encounters with survivors, one at a time. Data organization always refers back to the individual interview. And finally, data usage for research or teaching purposes entails watching the interview closely or while multitasking. Engaging with the recorded testimony of the individual survivor is still the preferred mode of learning about and from the Holocaust, as the new hyper-realistic volumetric technologies demonstrate. Now, the format of the personal interview is in fact so ingrained in public history and academic research that we often forget how uncanny it can be. Consider that Yad Vashem video of two identical twins who survived Auschwitz. Contrary to current practice, the sisters are interviewed not separately but together. And yet, they are eventually depicted as one person, as you can see. The one is the mirror image of the other. Since they complete each other's phrases, echo each other's words, respond in unison, even wear the same kind of clothes. Ironically, rather than restoring their humanity, the very format of the interview divests the two sisters of their fragile individuality. Now, how did we come to that? The current prevalence of the personal and personalized audiovisual testimony can, I think, be traced back to the prominence of psychologists and literary critics rather than historians, sociologists, or ethnographers in setting up the Fortunoff archive. Coming from disciplines concentrating on the individual rather than the collective, these scholars were epistemologically predisposed to focus on the singular survivor and her testimony. The influence the Fortunoff archive exerted over subsequent projects secured the reproduction of this model, whereas the Shoah Foundation Institute's Visual History Archive adherence to a redemptive narrative further reinforced it. Additionally, audiovisual testimonies have primarily been the subject matter of scholars in the fields of literary criticism, cultural studies, social psychology, and more recently media studies, whereas history and other social sciences have either neglected them or randomly utilized them for anecdotal purposes. Memory is, however, as we all know, a deeply social process. People reminisce, but they reminisce over a family table or recollect in groups, sharing or debating their common past experiences. One might therefore ask, how different would Auschwitz look if narrated not by isolated individuals in studios or under white light, but by groups of survivors, conversing, interrupting, correcting, or even teasing each other as they converge in representing Auschwitz as a shared collective experience? The serialized Holocaust audiovisual archive has therefore widened our knowledge of individual experiences and their remembrance, at the expense, however, I think, of paying attention to relations between Jewish prisoners in the camps. Such knowledge still remains sketchy. In public and scholarly imagination, extermination camps, and Auschwitz in particular, are predominantly represented as laboratories of death, mass graveyards in the making. Still, Auschwitz was a densely populated place, inhabited at any given moment by a transient population in the hundreds of thousands. A complex social world, it is often viewed as composed of isolated individuals. Consequently, what the place of certain Jewish groups was within it and how it changed over time remains a largely uncharted territory. We still know relatively little about the size and nature, reach and overlap of the social networks prisoners forged, the factors that facilitated communication, imposed boundaries, or promoted social trust. Much is also unknown about the gender dimension of these social networks, whether men and women develop different patterns of social interaction, or how the vocabularies of gender and sexuality, say for example the rhetoric of motherhood or sisterhood, inform the cultural meanings of relatedness. To reconstruct such networks and pin down their cultural significations is nevertheless necessary if we are to understand interpersonal relations and power dynamics in the concentration camps from the point of view of their victims, and eventually rethink the relationship between individual survival, collective belonging, and a liminal sense of selfhood. Now, such a turn to the social requires new cross-disciplinary collaborations. Holocaust studies have emerged at the convergence of history, psychology, literary criticism, memory, and trauma studies. However, a turn to the study of social relations necessitates, I think, a rather sacrilegious engagement with far less noble fields, such as, for example, the anthropology of incarceration and the sociology of criminal networks, of mafias and drug cartels, which focus on social relations among clandestine groups and examine trust in liminal environments and extreme circumstances. The concept of sociality further, I think, allows a shift from the individual, her survival, and her subjectivity to identity construed and constructed through social interaction. Now, sociality is an ethnographic category, and a very German one, coined by Georg Simmel, and denotes the cultural schemes that organize interpersonal relations by investing them with meaning. It emphasizes the symbolic content and cultural significations of relatedness, how people make sense of their interactions with others, and hence situates the production of identity beyond the individual or a generic collective. Sociality is therefore a more theoretically, I think, rigorous, historically grounded, and analytically flexible category than the rather descriptive notions of community or the inadequately historicized concepts of solidarity, survival, or humanity currently employed to account for relations between prisoners. I mean, how many times have we heard these words, right? They retained their humanity. They survived because of their solidarity. Their principal aim was survival, again and again and again and again. But we constantly fail to both conceptualize them and historicize them. So this conceptual reorientation can benefit, I think, digital humanities, as well as benefit from them. Note, for example, how the VHA, true to its serial logic, does not thoroughly tag all the people interviewees mention. Such tagging could, however, facilitate a move beyond the individual and no less the group approach, Polish Jews, Krakow Jews, to the audiovisual archive. It would enable, I think, a multi-directional research itinerary which, by combining interrelated testimonies, would effectively situate the individual within a specific network rather than subsume her in a generic collective. Conversely, social network software can substantially increase the research potential of the Holocaust audiovisual archive and generate new ways of organizing its material. what if the organizing principle was not the individual testimony, but a social relationship? Our project, Bonds of Survival, attempts to answer this question by tracking down the types, strength, duration, and extent of social relationships Sephardi Jewish survivors from the Greek city of Salonika established in Auschwitz-Birkenau. The second part of it, I can talk more about it in the discussion session, deals with networks in hiding and escape. In the spring and summer of 1943, nearly 46,000 Salonika Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Not belonging to the dominant Ashkenazi group, those Greeks, as they were coined, were seen as a misfit. Yet, their cosmopolitanism also facilitated contact. Salonican Jews were multilingual, speaking French and occasionally Italian next to Ladino and Greek. They were also culturally extrovert, having been exposed to French culture from a very early age. Once in Auschwitz-Birkenau, they utilized this rich cultural capital to interact, even bond with Jews from other, particularly French-speaking countries. The case of Salonican Jews thus makes evident the operation, I think, of more complex networks, networks that expand beyond the contours of locality, kinship, and nationality on which existing historiography largely insists. The multiple cultural reference help us understand the poetics of similarity, how familiarity was established between strangers in the first place, and how a liminal culture of relatedness was sustained in the camps. The cultural outlook of the Salonican Jews facilitates assessing the extent and nature of open, outbound social networks between Jews of different cultural and national backgrounds who could, for example, communicate in French, and conversely, check whether distinct cultural traits, Ladino, resulted in the formation of close, inward-looking networks that turned the superficially homogeneous camp world into a set of disjoint micro-societies. In short, the perceived exoticism of Salonican Jews renders them an exemplary case study and turns their testimonies into an unusually rich set of context-specific data to evaluate the broader importance of several key identity markers in shaping social relations and survival strategies in the camps. So what did we do? Project members utilized data drawn from 40 audiovisual testimonies. There exist around 1,500 testimonies of Salonican Jewish survivors in various archives, audiovisual archives. So we utilized data drawn from around 40 audiovisual testimonies to trace social networks in the camps involving at least 3 persons. Our main taxonomic categories sought to unveil the forms of communication and the cultural foundations of trust by documenting the languages used, as well as the role of friendship, kinship, and locality in forging intra- and inter-group relations. We also sought to determine the space and time of these relations, link them to specific venues in Auschwitz, or to different camps after its evacuation, and to the period of deportation, internment, death marches, and post-Auschwitz confinement. Finally, we tagged the imaginary as much as the physical relations. The result, I think, was a richer image of the camps as seen from the bottom up. So specifically, there we are. We detected a sizable concentration of Salonican Jews in the Sonderkommando unit and an even larger number in the satellite camp of Warsaw, established after the ghetto uprising with the specific purpose of clearing the rubble. Concentration camps are often treated as a homogeneous space, but our more precise categories can help researchers nuance their analysis of camp spatialities, as well as link network formation to specific spaces. It was easier to establish relations and networks in Warsaw than in Birkenau, for example. Additionally, attention to imaginary relations revealed how survivors often refer to individuals they had never physically encountered, such as Dr. Cuenca, a physician, member of the Auschwitz Orchestra, and head of a network credited with saving several Salonican Jews. Such findings not only reassert how a sense of community was built through affinities, both real and imagined, in even the most abject circumstances, they also reveal, I think, an individual's fame, helping us understand how status was attained among prisoners, who were the group leaders, and hence how a different set of power relations positively shaped social life in the camps. In short, it moves analysis beyond the binary opposition of perpetrators and perpetrated and the gray zone of the privileged prisoners. Now, to evaluate the circa 300 relationships recorded, create social data connectors, and map the social network of Salonican Jews, we use the Gephi graph visualization platform. A different coloring of the edges according to such attributes as friendship or kinship, as well as different combinations of attributes, as you see here, say, for example, languages of friendship or types of relation in Warsaw, offer a deeper mapping of social networks and the determinants of social trust in Auschwitz. When combined with the length differentiation of the edges according to a given relationship's strength, such visuals additionally reveal the determinants of intimacy, be that language, origin, kinship, or friendship. Now, we expected to see at least some overlapping networks operating, since we mainly data mine testimonies of interrelated survivors, either by kinship or by location, or common experience at Auschwitz. Instead, we encountered a fractured camp world composed of numerous but isolated ego networks. More data feeding will determine whether this is not in fact due to the small number of testimonies examined. Still, as you can see, one network stands apart. It consists of brothers Morris and Shlomo Venezia, their distant cousins, but mainly, in their own terms, good friends, Dario, Victor, and Jack Gabai, then Daniel Ben Achmias, an old friend from Salonika, and then Marcel Najari and Moses Mizrahi, their fellow inmates and eventual friends. Now, the Venezias and the Gabais, together with Marcel Najari, had entangled pre-deportation trajectories. Of Italian citizenship, born and raised in Salonika, they were part of the last polyglot generation, fluent in Italian, French, Greek, and Ladino. Once the war erupted, they all fled to Athens, joined the leftist resistance, were arrested, and after a period of imprisonment, finally deported to Auschwitz. There, they all served in the Sonderkommando unit, managing to stay close and assist each other. In January 1945, during the death march, Dario Gabai, the Venezia brothers, and Daniel Ben Achmias once again stuck together. Transferred to Mauthausen, they all eventually survived. The graph thus powerfully illustrates the existence of a complex closed-type network built around language, kinship, locality, nationality, and friendship, animated by a combination of pre- and wartime experiences and eventually solidified through the common ordeal of the Sonderkommando. So to conclude, when properly theorized, the use of digital network visualizations can therefore expand the conceptual spectrum of Holocaust studies, question the use of such non-historicized categories as solidarity and humanity, and renew the ties between social and Holocaust history by placing emphasis on the constitution and function of the social in the camps. Digital network visualizations introduce a new way of thinking about personhood during the Holocaust by reconceiving the individual survivor as a networked self. So far, the individual interview, the personal interview, has come to determine not only the serial logic of Holocaust audiovisual archives, but given their proliferation and accessibility, the Holocaust's very politics of representation. The testimony format recasts the survivor as witness, gives voice to the voiceless, and evidences the importance of the myriad individual accounts over the singular totalizing narrative of the perpetrator's archive or the historian's monologic text. The linear organization of most Holocaust audiovisual archives implicitly informs a distinct logic of individual-centered representation of the survivor and by default of survival as well. Yet, A methodological focus on social relations and the use of digital technologies as a means to visually represent them can redress this imbalance. Attention to the forms and structures of relatedness can lead to a better understanding of how prisoners attempted to reconstruct a social universe in the camps and navigate within it under extremely adverse circumstances. Such social network visualizations provide us with an adequately flexible tool to analyze the multiple relations between prisoners themselves, move beyond the perpetrator's gaze, and tackle the impasses of top-bottom approaches to Nazi genocidal ideology and its implementation in the camps, the entire historiographical discourse on dehumanization. They offer a glimpse to some of the organizing principles shaping incarceration and prisoners' society. Hence, they allow us to understand better how identities were not only forcefully imposed by the perpetrators, but also liminally crafted by the prisoners themselves, as fragmentary senses of the self produced through the discourses and practices of relatedness. Complementing the technology of audiovisual testimonies with that of social networks helps us not just restore the humanity of the survivor witness, but also contextualize it and thus historicize it. Data connectors may be dots and lines in a blank screen, but they eventually make us understand what it meant to be a prisoner and no less a human in Auschwitz. Thank you for your attention.
Is the micro on? Oh, yeah. So thank you very much for your presentation. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. Alberto. Yeah, please. Yeah.
This is great. I've been trying to do this, and I did this with social network analysis, visualizations, a little bit like you have done, but basically simply based on families and the structural, the location that we had. I honestly think this is the way to go forward, so I 100%. I really like what you're doing. I throw in two complications. One is that makes this even more complicated. One is that the networks that you are describing evolve over time. So I've done this with one survivor, the Gilberto Salmoni, that my collaborators know so much. And it's somebody that I interviewed a few months ago. I've been able to do that, and two things I kind of understood here. One is that these networks evolve over time. And the other, that it's very evident in the picture of Auschwitz that you showed, and something that I noticed with Gilberto Salmoni, with this person that I'm thinking about, that to me makes it so, that exactly. So if you look at this picture, and something you didn't really mention in your presentation was place. If you look at these two pictures, you immediately know, at least a geographer immediately notice, that scales are very different, and the situations are very different. So these are people who just arrived versus people who basically have already been checked in, and so by really conversing for many, many hours, just like you have done, the social networks that emerge and the kind of relationship that you have really very much depend on where you are, exactly, both temporally and geographically. So that's a really, it's, how do you see us, in a sense, I guess my question is, how do you see us going forward in introducing place and time into this?
Thank you. Tante grazie, Alberto. Di niente. I mean, there is a lot of fiction in this database and in this Gephi. It is, I'm sorry. Yeah. It is, in fact, a little bit more impressive, but also more impressionistic than it should be. I'm absolutely in accordance with you that networks evolve over time, definitely. We tried to slightly capture it by dividing the period of incarceration or the experience of the Holocaust in different stages. So including deportation, then Auschwitz, but also transportation to satellite camps, then the death march, and then the post-Auschwitz labor camps, and to a certain extent also the DP camps after liberation. But you're absolutely right that you cannot really pin them down day by day. You never know whether these 3 or 4 people actually knew each other during their period at Auschwitz, or whether a certain relation evolved in October and the second or third one in November or December. Unless you introduce, and that's why it requires so much manual work and so much close watching and listening, you introduce a sense of intuition of it, in it, by listening to many testimonies and understanding that, for example, certain places like Warsaw, where suddenly 300, 400 Salonican Jews were transferred because due to their alien language and therefore inability to communicate with the local Poles, to clear the rubble. And there, given the circumstances, so place there is really very important, they managed to develop a sense of a community and also liminally structure their own time. So they would eat together or they would sing together to a certain extent. The Sonderkommando is another case in point. Quite a few Salonican Greeks, surprisingly, were involved in the Sonderkommando unit. But this is, I've been struggling. I mean, how further can you go unless you integrate other material? Say, for example, perpetrator records on regarding, for example, the time of murder and or other types of records that relate to individual prisoner files and so on. Place, I think I've partially answered this question. Again, for me and for us is in fact very crucial. I mean, one of the foundational kind of principles of this project is that Auschwitz should be disambiguated. It should be considered as very many places evolving over time. And therefore, where you are, in the infirmary, for example, or in IG Farben, or in Warsaw, is in fact very crucial, or in one bunker or the other. Is in fact very crucial on the kind of relationships you build. So we are aware of these problems, but they still remain unresolved. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have only 7 minutes left, so can I ask you to be short and succinct with your question, so please. You just need to talk and then it will work.
Okay. So first just a comment.
No.
This photograph on the right. After. It's February 1995. Okay. So my question is that you did a wonderful job at the cost of misrepresenting the history of audiovisual testimony. So there are many occasions at which audiovisual testimony was recorded before Fortunov. And during the liberation, but later on in documentary film, Jean Rouge might be a good example here. And there is a number of issues that are connected to it. So I think it's not by accident that audiovisual testimony was, let's say, academically popularized by a psychoanalyst and a literary historian, because I think it's connected to a model of culture and modernity that was maybe superimposed on experience of people, but also some of these people had already this kind of modern mindset. Maybe not the Jews from Greece. So I think that, I mean, for your purposes, that was like a neat move, trying to point to this kind of connection between literary studies and psychoanalysis as the origin of audiovisual testimony. But I think it's much more complicated. And also, there is another question of authorship. So who's the author of testimony? I mean, if we have two people, sometimes more people, and there are some examples, maybe not of audiovisual testimony, but textual testimony from the Warsaw Ghetto, in which the author of testimony, for example, Abraham Krzepicki, after escaping from Treblinka, in fact was interviewed by Rachela Auerbach, who, well, ghostwritten the testimony, in fact, or whatever other name you may use.
Yeah, I want to come back to Alberto's question about time, and I wonder if migration studies would actually help us understand. If you think about the movement of RSTs, deportation, to one place, settling in for a certain time period, and then go to another place as kind of migrations, to how people, individuals, when they arrive somewhere, develop relationships, could be maybe an interesting way to understand these processes, where it's cramped in time, where it's kind of forced in one place, and where it's densely populated. But in essence, maybe it works in a similar way, because you go to people you know, right? There's even a chain of migration. You can see this also in concentration camps. So maybe this is a way as a model. And the second thing I thought about, there's this theory of Granovetter, weak and strong ties. Do you know about this? I thought this is actually a great model to understand group relations, especially under extreme circumstances, because it's about mobilization of resources. The more weak ties you have possibilities to mobilize resources. And in these circumstances, like in camps, this is everything what you need for survival. So maybe there's just...
In response to Alberto's question again, or an additional suggestion, Gephi is really good for showing certain things, but given your depth of knowledge of these people and the relatively small numbers you're working with, I would urge you to go to paper and start sketching and get your spatial and relational ideas down, and maybe some computer method will then help you do a sophisticated job or bring in more people, but you've got a lot more visual potential there than we're seeing yet.
So, very briefly, I agree with you that one should not blame the psychoanalyst for everything. But I think it does remain true that one sees a kind of a clear breaking point around 1978 with regards to the amount of testimonies recorded, at least in America, but also elsewhere, before and after. What bugs me, I mean, obviously there have been different ways of recording, not different, similar ways of recording testimony in the past. But what kind of bugs me is the fact that we take it so much for granted that we cannot really imagine different ways of asking a person to talk about the past. I mean, in our everyday life, our grandparents talk in banquets, on holiday tables, on Thanksgiving dinners. My own grandmother talked about the murder of her nephew while eating gyros and tzatziki on a Sunday evening in her hometown. She would never talk, not in public, let alone in private, between me and her. And this, I think, kind of interviewing has also even developed over time. I mean, Stephen just showed us yesterday an incredible testimonial, testimony of the Bergen-Belsen survivor testifying in front of the SS. During the Balkan Wars, entire committees would set up in the village squares and inquire survivors of ethnic cleansing to talk about their experiences. And then the surrounding public would intervene and say yes or no. And so it was a much more collective experience. So this is just, a way to kind of question a little bit of certainties. Wolf, thank you so much. I think these are wonderful suggestions. I think, migration studies should definitely be on our bucket list. And all the more so since the second part of the project deals primarily with networks of escape and hiding. And there, both weak and strong ties as well, the nature of the capital, financial capital, social capital, cultural capital matters. And I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I was actually very much inspired by your earlier presentation. Ideally, we would like this to link to the Fortunoff archive or the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, enrich it, bring the words of the survivors themselves in. We are as much interested in tagging, also in external categories, as in placing the voice of the survivor, placing the idea the survivor developed about that particular relationship in that context. He was like a brother to me. I loved him as my child, this kind of stuff.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let's move to our next speaker, Andrew Curtis. Thank you. So let me introduce Andrew. Andrew is the director of the GIS Health and Hazards Lab at Kent State University. He's the former director of the World Health Organization's Collaboration Center for Remote Sensing and GIS for Public Health. His scientific research work employs geospatial technologies and geographic information systems. For instance, he developed the spatial video methodology to map challenging environments. He also works on the application of Geo-narratives, which is used to give contextual insights to spatial analysis. This has been used to investigate landscape of crime, health, and most recently, the genocide landscape of Cambodia. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this conference. It's been really interesting for me. I know I'm a bit of an outsider. This talk is going to be very method-based, and so what I am asking you all is to think laterally about what I'm mentioning here, and maybe it could actually be applied in some of the other topics we've talked about. I'll go back for a second. Oh, it doesn't work in the same way as Windows. Hold a second. There we go. That's not me taking a selfie, that's me taking a photo of my video, taking a photo of me for metadata purposes. What I'm interested in here is, although we've had some really interesting discussions about the spatial aspects in narratives, in testimony, I'm interested in how do we actually capture narratives in such a way that we put the space into those narratives right at the get-go, right at the beginning, because that gives us a lot more flexibility in what we can then do with these data. At the same time, by capturing these narratives in the environment in which the person is experience what they're talking about, I believe the environment itself also stimulates new memories. And hopefully I'll give a few examples of this. I'm going to primarily look at the evacuation of Phnom Penh, and then also a little bit about the S-21 prison camp, which Timothy talked about yesterday. Just to give you a sense of why I think this is important, this is the main train within Cambodia. Now, during the Khmer Rouge rule, this was used to transport prisoners to prison, to death locations. It was also used to transport people from village to village for work purposes, as well as soldiers. So there was a richness to this particular train line. Now, one of our PhD students actually went and performed narratives or collected narratives at each of these train stations. And this is one of those times, I'm sure you've all experienced this, where a student goes out, does some great work, and then you think, yes, but why didn't you do this? Although there is a spatial context or a spatial connection in terms of the narratives were collected in each village, that was the level of space where it ended. He didn't go any further to find out what was happening within that village. And so many of these experiences were spatial. For example, one person laying down in a field as the train pulled in and what he then saw happening on the train. And so I was interested in how do we develop techniques to then start to capture this spatial aspect. And this is spatial video and then spatial video geo-narratives. This started with Hurricane Katrina. I was part of the geospatial response to Hurricane Katrina, and I immediately realized that, okay, we don't have a lot of good field techniques. One of which we then developed was a video camera with an inbuilt GPS. So when we go into the field, we can collect video, and at the same time, we know exactly where it is on the map. Since then, we have used it in multiple environments, in Los Angeles, for example, in landscapes of violence, the marginalized, in a variety of different overseas environments as well, including Haiti and the cholera epidemic. So quite often these are landscapes where it's data poor, very challenging environments. And we can collect these video using several different mediums: car, by hand, walking, put it onto a boat, put it onto a bike. And the key thing here, unlike maybe with some of the other talks, is we try and make everything as cheap as possible. We try and make everything as easy to use as possible, both software and also with the technology, because we want very much people, not us, to be collecting the data and then working with us. The spatial video geo-narrative is the spatial video with an audio recorder attached as well. And what we usually have is a car, somebody sitting in the front seat of the car narrating the landscape as we move through it. This narration is then transcribed, and I'll show you how we actually match it up to the map. But what I've actually done today is I've tried to throw a few things in, questions that were raised yesterday or comments that were raised, just to give my take on them. And this was said, or I'm paraphrasing, when you're in the space, you get a very different narrative. And I completely concur with that. I do believe if you are in the space, you're going to be stimulated by what you see, by what you smell, by what you hear. And this then leads to other memories, which maybe you wouldn't get in a more one-to-one relationship. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about the evacuation of Phnom Penh. This was on April 17th, 1975, when the Khmer eventually sort of took over the city. And we don't really know a lot about the evacuation apart from it as a homogeneous thing. People just left the city, they were forced out. You often hear about 3 days. Now, in the narratives we collected, 3 days was basically the Khmer Rouge saying to the population, you're going to leave the city for 3 days, and this is the amount of time it's going to take us to get rid of all the bad people. Now, this was just a trick, and you'll often hear trick in these narratives to get people out of the city, but it has an implication in terms of the evacuation. But what we were interested in is to what degree were these evacuations different? If, depending on where you were in the city, did you have the same experience? So we actually had 7 different narratives, transcribed the narratives that you see here. On the left-hand side, you've got a timestamp. Now, the timestamp of the narrative is going to be important because this is what we match up with our spatial coordinates. Remember, the camera has an inbuilt GPS, which also has a timestamp. The next thing is I reread the narratives for themes, and this is because there's a series of iterative queries that we're going to do with these narratives. And in general, there were 3 clusters of themes that I came to. The top one were exact spatial locations of buildings, the history of Phnom Penh, what happened before, but quite a bit before, and then what happened after the Khmer Rouge. The middle section of themes were all to do with the actual evacuation process in terms of where were you when the shelling started, what happened when the Khmer Rouge actually entered the city, where did the evacuation start from, the actual starting point, because this is important for the mapping, and also the route. And then finally, the last series of themes were what happened on the evacuation experience. So issues of food, water, toilets, where did you sleep, the violence that you encountered, and what was your experience with soldiers. So we have actually developed a series of different software to analyze this in different ways. This is a software called Word Mapper. So at the top, you enter in your transcription. Below that, you extract the GPS from the camera and you enter that in as another text file. You then link the 2 of these up by having the same matching timestamp. So now we've interpolated each word or each comment over the entire GPS path. Below that, you also see a query box, which is where you can put in keywords. So it was interesting yesterday, we talked about the importance of the search box. Well, this is a very iterative process. Once you put these pieces together and run this, you're going to have output of maps and you're going to have output of word clouds. And the maps are either as a GIS shapefile or in Google Earth. Again, not many people have GIS experience, so we are producing this in a spatial format that everybody has access to. The word clouds are not only the word clouds of the entire narrative, but a second word cloud actually goes along with all the comments associated with those search words you put in. So you actually have co-occurring words for those particular search words. And I'm going to talk about this again later because we've now spatialized this as well. The output maps, and here we're looking at Google Earth, are a series of points, but these points can either be every word as a coordinate or every beginning of a comment. So a sentence has a link to the point where that sentence starts. And you can see here with the yellow pins, these are those words we put into the previous search. So if you query them out, then they're going to be identified on this map. Again, for people without GIS skills, this is a nice way to be able to visualize the key terms you want. And for those of you who think, okay, are we reducing the narrative to simple points? Not really, because what we're able to do is then take those points and put them back into the narrative. And I'm going to show you that process in a second. These are all the word clouds from the 6 of the people we interviewed, again with the keywords at the top: body, dead, death, kill, shot, shoot. These were the first ones we put in. These were not going to be the last keywords. They were just to get a sense of what was happening in these particular narratives. I've said we've created quite a few different pieces of software for this. This is one of them. I'm lucky I've got a PhD student who's brilliant at spatial coding. What you see here, and there's a couple of reasons for developing this. When we collect spatial video, it is actually data intense. So each approximately 40-minute section of video is about 4 gigabytes of data. Now, we work with collaborators all over the world, and so getting the data from them is really tough. So what we have done here is you upload the data, or you upload the video to YouTube, a secure YouTube channel. You can have up to 4 of these windows. So here you see the left-hand side and the right-hand side, but you could have a center camera. You could also have the audio as well. We link it to the GPS path, and then we merge them all together into what we call a JSON file, which is a spatial file. This is a really small data sort of footprint, which means you send the JSON file to somebody and they can look at this entire sort of data set without need of a sophisticated computer. At the bottom here, you've actually got this links to Google Maps, but you can see the path. It moves concurrently with the video, but you can also put different KMLs, different Google Earth layers on top. So you could put the narrative on top of this map just here. And with another version of this, you can even start to digitize things onto that map. Watch the video, see the comments, start to actually sort of create features on your map. Now, another part of this, because we often work in environments where the GPS sort of fails on us, particularly in informal environments, was how do we improve the GPS? Well, you can digitize the GPS path, and it not only corrects the path, but you've now created a brand new GPS path itself, which when we link it back up to this video means you've got a nice path and video. But what it also means is if you've got video without GPS, this is a way to actually create spatial video. So some of you might want to think about, do we have video where we know the path that somebody has taken? We can now create the same sort of, in effect, spatial video using this tool. In general, and this is from my experience of working with narratives in a lot of different environments, you get 3 types of data. Spatially precise, where it is this corner, it is this house, it is this particular place. Spatially fuzzy, which is in the general environment. So I've got a section here. Yes, on this section of road, we were pushing the car along. But it's not tied to one particular place. It's fuzzier. And then spatially inspired. Although they're moving through the environment, they may not be talking explicitly about the space they're moving through, but it is generating other insights, other memories, other comments, which are important. So how do we actually use these data? Well, what I like about it is that it's an exploratory tool, but it's both exploratory for qualitative analysis and also quantitative analysis. So we have three components now. We have our transcribed data, which is now matched by timestamps, so every one of those words is linked to the map, which is also, no, it's not a link to the video. Now, go back again. So if we are interested in a particular segment of text, we can see exactly where that is mentioned on the map. If we want to, then we can look at the video to see what is being described. Now, I've actually got two different things going on here. In the previous mention, it talked about patients being left in the field. As soon as they are evacuated from the center of Phnom Penh, what the interviewee said, is that as soon as the family members were not around, they just left the people in the fields. This other interview here, they talked about a clinic where the doctors and the family members waited until the Khmer Rouge actually picked them all up, put them on a truck, and then sort of put them out of town. So what I'm trying to get at here is that you could have intersecting narratives that you can now link up both thematically but also spatially. If we look at the narratives themselves in terms of the evacuation, so what we're going to see here are just the paths, but again, these paths are actually the spatially located comments or points. So here we've got, and what I've done is I've changed the keyword now to bridge. So the yellow points are all the bridges. We have a southeastern evacuation for the first individual. This individual went straight out to the west, went straight out to the west. This individual took a slightly longer path, but again, it was a southwestern path out. Over on the eastern side of the city, this individual came here, and this ended up being a real clog point in terms of the evacuation of Phnom Penh. Narrative 5, same thing, different path, but again, you get to the bridge. And then finally, with narrative 6, a long way around, and then eventually ending up over the bridge. So we have these spatial similarities in terms of where each of these interviewed individuals ended up. Now, I want to also sort of talk a little bit about the Mappers Archive, because I think it's the point to put this in here. Previously, people, and I completely agree, that the map becomes a way to index other information. I think the point was made yesterday sort of several times, and I completely agree with this, because each one of those points in space now becomes a way to drill down to other narratives, other video, other information that you're actually extracting from these interviews. So what we have done is we created yet more software that we have a spatial database behind the map with all the video, with all the narratives. So if you then cut out a piece of the map, either virtually or in real terms, it will access all those video and all those narratives for that one place. So you sort of can do something similar in GIS, but that tends to be just for one. What we're doing here is saying, no matter how many data sets we've collected, now we can carve these out spatially. I put down Lower Ninth Ward at the bottom there because why this is important. After Hurricane Katrina, the first time I used spatial video of the Lower Ninth Ward. Now, we've all seen the pictures, you've all seen the video, but this is the only spatially sort of connected video we have of the Lower Ninth Ward, to the point where you can go to any point in the Lower Ninth Ward and see what it looks like at that particular location. Instead of just having video, you can actually map the video with its location. So, what can we do with these? And I think it's, again, some of the discussions that have gone on have been really interesting. Things about time, things about how do we actually go beyond the capabilities of a GIS. Well, by using these types of spatial sort of overlays, you get some interesting sort of questions or interesting insights in terms of here about the evacuation. For example, this individual is going up here, but then the only possible way was to the right because there was no directionality apart from away from the city. And so these evacuation paths, you could go any way you wanted as long as it was not into the city. At this point, two streams of people come together, and so he said the only place we could not go was left against the stream of people. You had to go to the right. In this particular situation, we've got a bridge. We have two individuals that go in this direction, and a third meets here. But when you read the narrative, what's interesting is that we were told 3 days, or they were told 3 days to evacuate the city, which meant that a lot of these people did not have enough food or water. They thought it was a temporary situation. And in fact, this individual's family hovered around the bridge because they believed that very soon they would go back. Eventually they realized, or were forced, oh no, we have to keep on the evacuation. So because they were told it was 3 days, they actually spatially cycled around this location. And for here, this is the main bridge, and we have 4 interviews that cross this bridge, and so you've got 4 sort of narratives about the conditions on the bridge, which were really quite bad. So this is just a snapshot. We've only really just started putting all this together, but some of the insights that have come from these narratives already are that not everybody left at the same time. So although the Khmer Rouge came in one particular day, some left that day, others left a day later, or even 2 days later. So that's the first sort of variation. The routes varied. It was up to the individual as long as it was away from the city. And the amount of violence on those routes also varied. Violence to the individuals on the route, but also the amount of what they saw along the route, the number of bodies, for example. This is an interesting sort of connection, I believe, to more recent situations. It was the 3rd day when people really started to suffer. So that's when the food and the water was gone, the heat involved, being in this forced march. So that's when things really started to go down. I'm going to skip through because I wanted to show you just a couple of other things. Another interview we did was actually one of the 2 survivors from the S21 prison camp. And I wanted to put this up because I think this gets at the topic of space and time. Now, we have just collapsed those different narratives together for one particular space, and we can gain insight from combining them. But you also have to realize that one individual has a complexity in terms of space and time. So with this particular individual, he has the evacuation experience, but because he was a mechanic, he was then brought back into Phnom Penh to work in the textile industry. So he would go around collecting sewing machines, repairing sewing machines. So he has a whole narrative about his experience living in Phnom Penh. Then he was arrested, brought to the S21 prison camp, and there he was tortured. And then there's yet another narrative, which is afterwards, when he was released from the prison camp. So 4 different periods, all with their own spatiality. And this is where context comes in. So this is actually where the textile sector of Phnom Penh was. So we can now map out areas of Phnom Penh which we have no previous information, but there's also context that goes into these. It's not just the location of where the workers producing the clothing for the Khmer Rouge worked, it's also how they lived and their relationship to those in charge of them. And in this case, if you're married, how often could you actually be with your husband and wife together? So there's context in the map, and it's not just space. So what are the next steps? Collecting more narratives, and very quickly. For example, this is interesting. This is by out in a more rural area. The Khmer Rouge had a lot of irrigation projects. This was a dam that was constructed, and so a narrative along the dam with a village chief. What's interesting about this is beyond the actual Khmer Rouge period, there was a lot of fighting that went in this area with the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese. This led to a lot of shelling, but it also led to a lot of mines being left. So the people who live in this particular area, they have a problem with mines. The dam has been failing, which means they have a problem with flooding in their particular community. And also, as the village chief then said, is that we have a big drug problem with the youth who are actually forced to come and work in this area, and the community that has grown up since. We're continuing to collect other narratives for the the occupation of the city, so that the Phnom Penh, we don't have a lot of information about the mapping of it in terms of where certain buildings were. We can start to enrich those maps. And I sort of skip through these. This was actually something I thought at the end. People were talking about geoparsing yesterday. I wonder whether this is also a data set you could actually start to experiment a little bit with, because you've got the spatiality that goes along with the narratives. And finally, we have new software that's been developed. You've already seen this, but one of the reasons why we also developed this was so we could use it in schools. So we are collecting a lot of video, and in schools where children no longer have the ability to actually have real field trips, we're collecting a virtual field trip bank. So school kids can actually navigate through these sort of streets to actually see what this particular topic. But there's also, this potentially could be used to collect data for individuals who are here in the United States. Once we've collected enough of these routes, instead of having to go to Phnom Penh, you could then do, it wouldn't be as good because you don't have all those sensory cues, but it's still a way to collect data for those who are no longer in the city. And finally, this software we keep developing. This particular one is an updated version of WordMapper that now has the comments in the right-hand side. You can actually go through once it's been mapped out, put them into thematic categories. You can also identify the degree of spatiality with each of the comments, so you can do different analyses on space or fuzzy space, which is something we've been working with quite a bit in this, using these tools. And the word cloud option here is now spatialized. So when you create a word cloud from your keyword search, you can see exactly where that is on the map as well. So we're trying to combine these different search tools together. And I think that's it. Various acknowledgements to everybody.
Thank you very much. Questions? And please.
Andrew, thank you. This is a marvelous method that I think could be adapted to so many topics related to genocide and many, many other things, and a great way to get students involved as well. I'm curious if you prepare the narrators in any way, and whether any of them have told their stories before, something that's an interesting issue in Holocaust testimony. And I also wonder, as you're traveling with them, do you note, or do you ask them to note what has changed or what has gone from the landscape?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, the only preparation really we have with the person given the interview is we tell them about what we're interested in. So if it was evacuation, for example, we're interested in your evacuation route, where you lived, and then your experiences along the route. And so that's pretty much it. And most of these have never sort of testified previously. The only person that's not true with is actually the prisoner from S21. Now, we've worked with him quite a bit before. He's even come across to our university to give a talk. So, but this was the first time he's ever done this spatially. So although he has been interviewed many times previously, I mean, this was the first time where he went around the city pointing out the key locations of his life when he was working in Phnom Penh. And I didn't talk about it, but we had a conversation over dinner about the impact on the person working with these narratives. And I was there for that particular narrative, and it didn't affect me the same way as when I then reread the narrative and mapped it out. So I thought that was interesting in terms of how, in the cold light of day away from the field, it was a different impact emotionally on me, anyway. The third question was, yes, because actually part of what we want to do here as well is to map a city that has no maps. And so they would talk about, no, this was paddy field, these were different types of houses. Some buildings were the same, but they changed the use. So yes, I mean, we said anything like that is going to be useful to us. So it becomes a very rich sort of spatial history of Phnom Penh at that time. Yes.
Thanks. A related question, and I was also thinking about Tamash's talk yesterday. There's the important figure of Kitty Hart, who was interviewed on site, but then also did kind of interviews at the Shoah Foundation, etc. So, what are the real distinctions, I guess, that you saw between the spatial testimony and the non-spatial testimony, as it were. And I'm thinking not just, well, there was a field here, but actually the kind of experiential parts of that. Because I did think it was interesting the way that you kind of toggled back and forth. The text was about the individual and his or her experience, but your visuals were actually at the scale of the route. So you didn't actually take us over the bridge, for example, or say, I crossed the street, or I met someone here. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what is it about, what are the distinctions between that spatial evidence that you learned from the camera that were different than a kind of regular testimony for the individual survivor?
Right, I'll actually go with the S21 survivor. Although he had talked about when he was arrested, what happened in the narrative as we followed the path, he says, it was actually, I was tricked. I mean, this is where I lived. I was picked up. I was told I was going to be taken to Vietnam. So I was put into a truck. We drove through the streets. We then came to the outside of S21. So we asked them, we asked him, did you know what it was? And he says, no, we didn't. So I was just sitting confused in this truck. And then, although you could see the wall, you didn't really know what was going on. Then a guard came in, hit him, and actually dragged him inside. So in the regular testimony, although that information is there, this puts it into so basically the spatial locations going from where he was to where he actually goes inside. And there was more power in that, to actually see these spaces. And you're right, I was presenting maps of the overview, but you can drill down to any of these sort of smaller locations and show the video, which is one of the reasons why we do it. So when he was talking about where he worked in the city, he talked about different buildings he would go to, where he saw people shot on the corner. You can go to the video and see exactly where he was talking about. So you can change scales. You can go from the bird's eye right down to what he was seeing during the narrative.
Really, really cool work. The question I have is really about the nonlinearity of memory and how you handled that.
In this case, it was sort of forced because we were doing the evacuation, and that was the only thing that was sort of in that particular, those narratives, it was just all about the evacuation. So it was only really a 4-day period that people were remembering. In terms of, I mean, actually, we probably the closest sort of problem we have to what you're talking about is the chief, the village chief that was on the dam, because he was talking about events that range from when he was first sort of moved to that location all the way through to all the what has happened in his sort of village now and the sort of social problems and the health problems he was facing. So is that what?
Yeah, well, one question is, did you make any attempts to rerun the route a second time and see if different memories came up, or memories that may have appeared later in the route but didn't seem relevant to share because it was geotagged to that location?
No, but we didn't. That's a good idea. But I mean, what I would say, and I think you hit on an interesting point that I found with other narratives, and that is a person is more likely to talk about what they think is inconsequential on this particular type of interview than maybe if they're sitting across a table. They'll just talk about a building or a corner, and it wouldn't be in their mind normally. But when they see it, oh yes, that is where I used. So there's a lot of information about what was it like to grow up in these neighbourhoods. From their perspective, sort of this is what I was doing before the Khmer Rouge took power.
Thank you. Really interesting work. I was just wondering about, I suppose this is about the sort of the linear nature of testimonies as well, or lack thereof. I know when I've taken survivors back to site, particularly elderly survivors, sometimes you'll walk on from a particular location and you may even get some distance away from a place, and then suddenly they'll recollect something about a place that was maybe, 10 metres away, 20 metres away, etc. So I just wondered whether if a survivor starts to talk about something along a route that doesn't relate to that particular place, whether you make any attempt to move it back to the location that they were actually talking about.
In these particular situations, no, because these are actually driven ones. But we have collected other narratives where that becomes more important. And this actually gets to another question, which is the fuzziness of space. When somebody talks about a spatially specific location, where is that actually marked on the map, and how fuzzy does space get? So we're looking at that, and we're developing tools to be able to sort of map out, well, if somebody starts talking about a feature, is it when they see it? Is it when they know they're coming close to it? Is it after they pass it? As you said, it could be something that they see, and then it takes a little while before the memory hits them. So all of this fuzziness we can actually try and get at from the data set, because we have it all spatially coded, and we have the video, so we know exactly where they're talking about. I mean, presuming that there is a feature that we can go back and see.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Just a very quick question. I want to thank you. There's lots and lots to think about in that presentation. This is just based on the slide you showed, in which the description seems to thicken as you move away from sort of at the destination to inspired by. And I'm wondering whether or not it's possible, counterintuitively, that memories descriptions thicken as we move away from that space, that in fact the space can operate as a constraint on testimony, on memory. Just, I mean, again, just based on that slide, is it the case that that the further away we get, not necessarily the richer, the deeper, but the thicker those descriptions become, the less linear, the more extrapolated and so on?
That's an interesting question. I don't know, but I think we could investigate it. I mean, that's what I like about this particular sort of the data set and the way we're trying to put it together, the software. That is a question we could start to look at in terms of the connection to where events is being described and how it's being described.
Thank you. I was wondering if you can talk more about the relationship between collecting all this data and developing the software, and if you're doing these responding to each other, or...
Yes, absolutely. That's I did have a slide and didn't really talk about it where I said it's iterative, and that was again a point that was raised yesterday. So it's an iterative sort of investigation of the data through the different sort of mechanisms, keywords, word clouds, whatever. But it's also an iterative software development, because as I'm going through this, I come up with new ideas, or I think questions like we just had, that would be cool to look at. And so luckily, my student is brilliant, and so we then sit down, we sketch it out, we actually think about how can we plan this out, and we come up with a new version of the software. So it's not just an iterative investigation of the data, it's an iterative version of the software as well. We just keep new ideas pop up. We think it would be really cool if we could do it this way or this way. So.
Hi. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was very intriguing, compelling. I wanted to go back somewhat to what kind of what Anne was asking earlier, but my question was in terms of going into the field and going out there where you said some of these people have never testified before. I'm curious what kind of either language skills or content or cultural competencies your interviewers were trained with or had in preparation for interviewing, kind of knowing where to continue to ask for questions or where there might be interesting pockets to glean more information from?
That's a great question. In this particular situation, we're very lucky because another PhD student who goes out with us in the field all the time, he worked for 5 or 6 years at DC Cam as one of their interviewers. And so he had been trained. He had, I think I mentioned earlier, a black book of all contacts. So, I mean, we would often go through him to find the right people. But he knew what he was doing in terms of an interview, and he had a lot of experience. But that would obviously be a challenge if we were going into the field cold. Yeah. In fact, I couldn't imagine doing it without somebody of his skill set.
Thank you. It's also, thank you very much for the presentation. I think the idea such is very motivating to start narratives. My question is, how do you plan the trips? Do you know the route we are going to go? Is that something that is talked before, or it happens in the moment? There are so many factors in an interview that can.
Yeah, and this is actually true of all the narratives we collect. We don't structure it at all. We put it all on the person who's sitting in the front seat. So it's like, you tell us, you take us where you want to go. So we will follow whatever route you have. So in other environments, the person will take you to places that are important to them. With the evacuation, we did give them that sort of restriction in terms of we want you to actually take us along your evacuation path. But it was entirely up to the individual to say where that path was. So there was no pre-planning.
Can I ask a question before you? I'll take my mic runner duties. So and I know 20 minutes is impossibly short to talk about this, but in the maps you showed, again, it was mostly individual movements. And I'm wondering, in terms of how the data is organized, if I am looking at a map of Phnom Penh and I click on a particular point in the map, can I then see the 20 people whose narratives pass that point?
Absolutely, yes. And that's what I was saying about we can now carve out space in such a way. So if we're interested in the bridge, we can now draw an area around the bridge and all the narratives and all the video that intersect with that one point. We can either virtually bring them out or actually carve them out and bring them out. But we can combine the narratives together. So we could look at each narrative individually, but we could do the same things with the complete sort of collection of all narratives. So if you're looking for key themes, for example, it could be over a larger population than just the individual. So we're just trying to have as much flexibility as possible to investigate the data.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to pick up on your response to the question from Sandra conducting the interview. And I was thinking about this because actually thinking about the visualization of time and space in an interview with the accordion. When you think about the moving car and the narrative, did you slow down the car when somebody talked about a house in length? Or did you have the same speed all the time? Would you stop the car if this, the conversation was going on and on? How does this match up with traffic? Yeah, so...
Actually, yes to all of the above. We would slow down, we would stop. Yeah, it makes no difference on the algorithm. So, I mean, we can now map it out. I mean, what you're doing is timestamps and then the actual physical distance. And so you interpolate between the two. So it doesn't matter how slow, how fast you go. Quite often it is actually road speed, which is the biggest challenge because they're quite hectic and busy roads. But yes, if there was something of particular importance to that individual and they wanted to stop and talk about it, we would just stop and then, in fact, the clinic I showed, that particular individual, that was where he started the evacuation. He talked about being on his balcony, waiting a whole day, watching what was happening on the streets below, seeing these things, and eventually realizing he's going to have to evacuate as well. So we just sat there for quite a while as he was explaining and describing the environment around him at that time.
So let me introduce the last speaker of this panel, Eric. Thank you. So Eric arrived from France, where he recently accomplished his postgraduate studies. In his dissertation, Eric examined the transformations of the Soviet city of Riga after 1945. Eric is a specialist of urban history and history of housing. At the moment, he's a researcher at the Institute of Political Sciences in Nanterre. Since 2015, he has been leading a project on the releasing or the redistribution of confiscated Jewish homes during wartime Paris. In addition to this project, Eric also studies housing, confiscation and anti-Semitism in Riga during the Second World War. Eric, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you both. It's very challenging. I'll do my best. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present this collaborative project we have been having on Paris for a couple of years now. Together with my colleagues Isabelle Bacouche and Sarah Gensberger, we've been building a team of scholars to study the persecution of the Jews in occupied Paris from 1940 to 1944. The starting point of this study is the record collection of the so-called rehousing office that reallocated to non-Jews thousands of apartments hitherto inhabited by Jewish families in Paris in 1943 and 1944. These records bring many opportunities to think at various scales and in many ways on where the Parisian Jews lived during the persecution, where the new tenants came from, their interactions, and how they experienced the confiscation of homes or benefited from it. Of course, it's about Paris, which is totally forgotten this history of the persecution, although hometown to 200,000 Jews before the war. And that is about 2/3 of the Parisian Jews, of the French Jews. Many of them fled at different stages from the city. About 40,000 of them were arrested in the city during the occupation, roundups or individually. And about 50,000 of them would have still been living in the city when it was liberated in August 1944. This study is important because not only Germans and Eastern Europeans benefited from the Holocaust, but moreover crossed with other archives. The records of the rehousing office I will talk about help thinking more largely about the local dynamics of the persecution, about how the Holocaust was rooted in daily life environments, and I hope we can get on this discussion. Maybe our team will develop, and I hope will develop later, some new digital tools, and I will be happy to discuss that. But my point here is first to reflect on what we do as historians with digital tools and how they interact with our research on the Holocaust. I will present basic tools and first maps. It's a work in progress. I will explain first then how GIS helps us at early stages of the research to process sources and these records, and how sound productions will help us later to disseminate the results to a large audience. Reflecting the progress of our investigation, I will discuss these housing issues at 3 scales: the whole city, district, and street and closer neighborhood. Let me first present shortly the policies of rehousing or of spoliation of the rental apartments. During the 4 years of the occupation of the city, 1940 to 1944, local administrations were subjected to the French Vichy government and to German military occupation authorities. A Vichy-appointed prefect governed the Seine department with about 5 million people and 100 municipalities, that is 20 districts in the inner city with 3 million people and 80 municipalities in the suburbs with 2 million people. Along with German authorities and the French Commission for Jewish Affairs, the department's administration or prefecture implemented many aspects of the anti-Jewish persecution. From early 1942, a German office called Dienststelle Westen fully robbed and emptied the apartments of Jews, whether they were exiled, just arrested or hidden, and sent the furnishings to the Reich. Up to 30,000 apartments were looted in less than 3 years. And that's my point here. From spring 1943, the prefecture, with the Commission for Jewish Affairs and then alone, utilized many of these apartments to rehouse non-Jewish Parisian families, whether Jewish tenants still paid their rent or not. Thus, a new office was created for this purpose in the prefecture administration and operated in the whole department, in the whole city. This office selected new non-Jewish tenants and enforced its choice onto property managers. Officially, the prefecture referred to 3 priority categories of families to be rehoused: families who lost their homes because of German requisitions, of urban planning projects, and mostly of Allied bombings. In practice, the prefecture also considered many other categories, such as families recommended by the Wehrmacht or by the Dienststelle Westen or by French officials. This is now how this collection, the collection of the rehousing office, looks like. This is the deposit sheet. The collection was given to the archives, departmental archives, in 1962 and called Requisition Files of Empty Apartments for the Benefit of Individuals listed by Street, 1942-1944. The collection holds also lists of apartments. This is just a short example, classified by street and number with the date. Beneficiary is the new non-Jewish tenants. Here, provider is the Jewish tenant Here we find the requalifications and euphemisms after the war. This was all done after the war. And then most of the records are apartment files. Here is how they look like, identified by a name and an address here, Lachner and 258 Voltaire Boulevard. With many documents inside, correspondence, forms, applications, I mean from 1943 up to 1945 or 46 even. There are about 9,000 apartment files, plus fragmented information on 2,000 other apartments. All in all, we estimated the files come from the releasing of about 6,000 apartments. I built up a database with these 6,000 cases, and then I projected them very basically in a GIS. This is the simplest map I could do. The result is in several aspects different from previous tries to locate persecution and to locate the residences of the Parisian Jews in the city, especially based on the addresses recorded by Serge Klasfeld for children deportees, address of arrest, or addresses registered during the arrest or after the arrest. Here the work of Jean-Luc Pinol on arrested children. And my point is here to compare and to think about the comparison of both maps. In my opinion, this helped thinking about many things, about the places of residence of the Parisian Jews before and during the German occupation, but mostly also about where the looting happened, about, and for my point here today, and about what is actually this collection and what are these addresses. The main difference, I put it here to be just clearer, with this pattern, just numbers of apartments in the city to locate other kinds of concentrations of the apartments and addresses looted and reallocated. The deportees map highlighted high concentration in the north and the east of the city, especially in poorer areas, and this result was put forward. On the contrary, this maps of the looted and reallocated apartments shows quite more addresses in the south and in the west. Thus, the comparison of both sets of maps, because it's not only one map, of course, allows to think about addresses. What is actually an address? In the end, a place for living, a place for hiding, a place for looting, or just a declaration to the administration once you're arrested. The different sets of records, especially testimonies of those of the police, which especially looked for the successive address of people in hiding, will help reconstructing survival and hiding trajectories of individuals in the city and the various perspectives of the records on them, especially of the rehousing office. Second difference, on the rentals map, here addresses are even more concentrated in the inner city. That's what, with the limit with the suburbs in black here, with only 2% of the addresses in the suburbs, although no less, Jews in the suburbs were as much arrested and looted as in the inner city. Why so? Let's look further at the files to answer this question. Among the 6,000 documented cases of rehousing, 400 hold an application form fulfilled by the non-Jews to move in. Here are two examples, two types of forms. The regular one on the left and the one for bombing victims on the right, with many kind of informations, name, date, profession, place of work, previous address, address after the bombing for the bombing victims, shelter. And these forms allow to reconstruct the trajectories of those who moved in. The first main result, there are many things to say about that. I would maybe highlight just one main first result, is that about 40% of these new tenants moved from the suburbs into the inner city. They came mostly from bombed areas, and this influx of suburban residents into the inner city is, as far as I know, totally unknown, and opposed to our knowledge of the growing city centrifugal. I located here the four main areas of bombings where the new tenants came from. These are bombed areas in area the Allied bombed mostly after April 43, mostly in the west, and then the later bombings in April 44 in the north, including part of the inner city, and on the northeastern part of the city. In their forums, in the fourth in line for preferred neighborhood, many applicants write in Paris and not in the suburbs, in Paris in any district, or out of the endangered areas. Indeed, the belief that the inner city would not be bombed was very widespread, even after 3 districts were even bombed in late 43 and 44. Indeed, suburban applicants clearly expressed their will to move to the inner city and to flee bombed areas or areas considered as dangerous. Others used to work in the inner city and wanted to get closer to the work, as the suburban transportation had become inefficient because of alerts and curfews. Beside this move from the suburbs to the inner city, probably many various aspects of the rehousing policies may explain why the addresses are so concentrated as well in the inner city. For example, bombed out municipalities, such as Courbevoie in the northwestern suburbs, deemed it inopportune to rehouse their residents on their territory and encouraged them to evacuate to the inner city, to other places, and help them even to find a Jewish rental in the inner city. But several arguments suggest also that we are missing something, that we are missing files concerning the suburbs. In the records, we find many hints that there were many more cases in general than the 6,000, especially in the suburbs, but we lack the corresponding files. Above all, we know that after the war, the prefecture isolated the supervision of the suburbs and of the inner city in different services, and new administrative boundaries drawn in the 60s between the inner city and the suburbs reinforced this division at the time when the collection was given to the archives. So could it be the collection was divided at some point? In this sense, the rentals map could be the product of the behavior of these institutions, of public policies in the 40s and even later in the 60s, and of the history of the record collection and what we tend to understand of it. So let's be careful not to impose later special categories to the social reality of what happened in the early 40s. That's why during the following steps of the investigation, we shall think about these absences, about these silences, compare these records with others, and make sample studies on smaller territories, and this is my point. So let's shift the scale and look at the 18th district. In yellow, I just put up 4 streets where about 120 Jewish apartments were reallocated, all in all, by the rehousing office. This is the map of the previous addresses declared by those who moved in. You can see that some new tenants were already living in the district by that time. Many of these neighbors had lost their home during the bombings, and here they are, the stars. Indeed, on 21st April 1944, the American Air Force severely bombed this area and destroyed large housing blocks. At least 500 bombing victims of the 18th district were given an apartment by the rehousing office. More largely, bombing provoked a climax of looting in this district. Local authorities noted many acts of violence committed against the Jews' vacant apartment because people just moved in and had broken in. But all new tenants didn't directly arrive from a destroyed building. Some addresses are declared as temporary shelters. Here I put them the red points. These are hotels or places by acquaintances, other places to remain after the bombing. And many other beneficiaries just moved in from a safe place nearby. Here I put it closer. The greens point are just people who are not connected with the bombings, are just moved in close nearby. In the Holocaust research, the word neighbor is very often used to designate perpetrators, bystanders, including profiteers, especially in Eastern Europe. But it is used mostly in a broader sense of former compatriots or living in the same region, and is mostly applied to smaller cities or to villages. It's rarely used in Western Europe and in main cities. Here we can come back to a more basic meaning of this word, I think. Neighbors living in close proximity and then possibly engaged with the Jews in social relations before and during persecution. This category is not used in the rehousing office. I just put it up, and it emerged very clearly out of the maps, out of the processing of the collection in this district, but as well in any other district that was not bombed. And in the form, applicants had to fulfill. I show you saw two examples. In the line preferred municipality or district, most of them asked to be resettled in the same district where they were already living in. So the GIS helps reconstructing in a quantitative manner the trajectories of the successive tenants, Jewish, non-Jewish, measuring the distances and moves. We can imagine many tools to compare the distances according to the time, to the smaller neighborhoods, to the houses, to redefine proximity maybe, and help thinking about the consequences of this proximity in the persecution. One short example maybe. The family living here was, a Jewish family living here at the beginning of this street. The father was arrested in the main roundup on 16th July 42. The mother went in hidden with children in different places, especially close nearby. In March 1944, that is 1.5 years later, the Dienststelle Westen emptied the apartment. She then stopped to pay the rent just immediately after the neighborhood was bombed, and the family living right there moved quite rapidly into the apartment with an authorization of the housing office. As we know from the work of colleagues, denunciation of Jews are very often strongly connected to housing issues. Though, as far as we know, most of these non-Jewish tenants I've been talking about had not denounced the Jews they overtook the apartment from through rehousing policies. But the only fact that they were living nearby and possibly knew this family is an important result when thinking about how did these non-Jews know about the looting, about these policies, what they knew about the fate of the Jews, and what is indeed a neighborhood in an occupied city, to what extent do local social networks interact with the persecution. I think we can, there are many points of discussion with other cases I would be happy to talk about. Here I come to a third scale of the investigation, that is the street or a closer neighborhood, which is also a scale we chose for the dissemination of the research, and this is the main point I will be talking about, although we could also talk about mapping. Indeed, we think first that this level of analysis is necessary to go deeper into analysis of the links between social interactions and the persecution. I had in these 2 days kind of calls for this need. And second, that the precise location of events and life during the persecution allows to make coherent samples of massive archival collections and of series of testimonies that are often difficult to confront with each other and which are often disconnected from the places they refer to. In addition, as for Budapest, the fact that Paris was largely not destroyed during the bombings and or later during urban planning projects allows to link the dissemination to spaces that still exist. I remember this recent film made with testimonies of Jewish survivors of an apartment building in the 10th district, and how some of them couldn't believe today that the building was still standing there. Thus, my colleague Sarah Gensberger is initiating a series of short audio accounts It happened here, Voices from the Shoah in Paris, in French and English, based on a simple principle. The utilization of original sources, archives and testimonies of victims, persecutors, bystanders, neighbors, that connect with locations in the city. Some of them will focus on neighborhood issues, and I will shortly talk about them now to conclude. These original sources will be contextualized with comments, recreation of sound environments, and of course, the still existing spaces. The production will draw on the previous experiment developed with Isabelle Bakouche on another topic and time period. The reports will be free of access on the internet. There are many interesting aspects to discuss. Transformation of sources into sound, places of the sounds in the sources, footsteps in the staircase, for example. I will just present briefly preliminary work and research we are doing now at this scale and for dissemination. Beside testimonies of the survivors and archival sources produced directly by the persecution and confiscation, there are plenty of sources that we can connect with personal trajectories through names and addresses. I mean, once you have a name or an address, you can find plenty of archival sources. Holocaust scholars rarely confront them. I mean here, school archives, housing archives, amounts of papers produced by the dealing with the consequences of the persecution after the war, such as trials to retrieve apartments. I know this case for Paris, these are amounts of paper nobody has never looked at. For a sample of streets, we will look for various sources and focus on those that refer to spaces and places that locate people and events in the materiality of the city. We already started to gather sources for the Mary and Louise Street in the 10th district, drawing on Sarah Gainsbourg's previous work on rescuers that lived in this street especially. And the result is amazing. Indeed, the number, a variety of bystanders that appear in the different accounts is, and who are engaged in social relations with the persecuted is very high. Many sources allow even to document the survival strategies of persecuted families that eventually were not arrested and for whom we have quite less accounts in the persecution files. And even though the putting together of neighboring situations that seem disconnected is very impressive. I think of the discrepancy, for example, between the mobilization of neighbors of a whole house to save one Jewish child and not the others living next door. And I see at this scale many possibilities to integrate these different point of views, I mean, persecutors, perpetrators, neighbors, concierge, into different kind of reconstructing this social interactions during persecution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, Alina.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really fascinating. And as we know from other more or less educational environments or projects, these connecting back to the physical space of cities is extremely powerful and works very well. While you were presenting, the first part especially where you were mapping, I wanted to ask about time. How do you work with time in here? How do you integrate the different moments of bombings, the different shifts, the different moments that people were actually arrested or fled their apartments? So are there time patterns that you can illustrate as well? And then my second question would be, aside from what I would call an intervention into the cityscape, what you're doing with this It Happened Here project, how will you integrate further sources aside from these housing sources into the mapping out of neighborhoods?
Thank you for your questions. Yes, the time question, I had no time to talk about it. Of course, just elaborating on what we have in these forums, we have dates of application. We have almost always the date of the looting, the date of the application, the date of the holding of the seal, I don't know the name, the ceilings or the door ceilings, the date of authorization to move in, the date of moving, so we can really reconstruct that in many ways. We haven't done it yet. What appears from a general reading of that is that there's a clear climax of the authorizations of rehousing during the bombings of April 44, which connects with many other things, with need and will of the Vichy regime to make consequences of the war a bit easier for French people. This connects also of the visit of Pétain to Paris in this time, and this is a kind of climax. But more in general, there are many ways we can make some kind of quantitative analysis to check places with time periods, chronologies, rhythms. I don't know the result yet. It's maybe not sure we can find patterns. The problem is that we have very few information about the rhythm of the looting. We have a kind of general rhythm of the looting by the Dienststelle Westen, but it's very unclear. And there is often a very clear discrepancy between the timings. I mean, some apartments were looted very quickly but reallocated very lately, or some were looted and reallocated in 3 days. So it's very probably difficult to find patterns, but we'll have a try. I don't know yet. For the integration of further sources, well, I don't know yet. The housing thing helps to locate people. So the first thing is that, okay, we know, for example, in the Mary and Louis Street, 4 families were deported. Only 2 had their apartment reallocated. So we're looking for further records. Why didn't the other, or how were they hiding? And well, it's kind of basis to start doing something. I don't know yet, but we can integrate. I mean, not only for dissemination with the sound records, but more in general. We haven't done that, so we're very happy. I have no idea what comes up. I mean, we're just starting that.
Thanks. Yes. Thanks again for another great panel. And it's a 2-part question. First thing that came to my mind with your housing and spatial stuff was the possibility of pursuing reparations for especially those whose genocide is being denied, one of which we could talk about Darfur, we could talk about the Armenian genocide, the precursor to the Holocaust and the exemplar for Lemkin's term genocide. So first that, if you could briefly, not just within the Armenian scenario, but others, where is that today? How does GIS as a forensic tool appear within, world court, etc.? The second part sort of segues into the Armenian scenario, where you have not only a genocide that is, how should I put it, it severed its indigenous population from its indigenous home of thousands of years. The Armenian scenario, there were massacres for hundreds, if not thousands of years, but what differentiated 1915 to 23 is that severing from a topography, not only geographic, but cultural and demographic, with all its intricacies at each tier. So not only does that occur, but you have a denialist state that to this day not only denies, but destroys, yes, systematically, the traces, both human and material, of that entity. So when we start speaking about GIS and mapping and creating trajectories, and then if we go further to the reparations issue, what is a poor genocide survivor's progeny to do? Are there ways to sync up memories and GPS actual coordinates and then talk about what was once there? You get my drift. Thank you. Huh? Or maybe, if you don't, tell me and I'll try not to be so
I'm not sure I get your point. What is very clear is that in the Parisian case of the 40s, and this is probably not the case for other smaller cities, other time periods, is that the records are very well organized. This is paper, this is administration, this is a very strong administration recording everything, what floor, left link, what door, what type of apartment, and we can locate things, and this helps, I mean, for reparation, this helps considerably. I would like also to. I found a kind of something in the room when I showed the picture of the deposit of the archives and the name and the naming. This is also probably very interesting, and we still don't know why the file is called like that. There are many interpretations. Actually, according to French law, after the war, such records shouldn't exist, because they should have been destroyed. Many of such other persecution records have been destroyed because they refer to religion and ethnicity of a community, and this is not allowed to. So it could also be that naming the files this way could be a way of preserving it at some point. So it's very complicated. We don't know yet. So, but at some point also, the reason why these files had never been examined is probably that it's called requisition and a reallocation of apartments to individuals. I mean, nobody has. I think 4 scholars have been looking at them for in the last 50 years. And they are totally open. They're accessible. They've been accessible for 60 years. I mean, it's very incredible. Well, but I'm not sure I answered your question. Yeah.
I have 3 questions. Wonderful work, Eric. Has anyone mapped Jewish arrests, and can you bring those into relationship? Second question, from what you've said about people from the suburbs requesting apartments in the city, at least after bombings, that might suggest that Jews would not have known those who replaced them, or those who come in did not know who they were replacing. And is that a significant part of the story, possibly? And then I have a suggestion for street-level visualization of buildings with light and dark windows, or windows that are perhaps one color when they're occupied by Jews, and then they change color, go blank, and then are filled by someone else. And some examples I might show you later on.
Thank you, Anne. Maps of arrest, yeah, there is this map of arrest of children. This is only for children. But the problem, this is based on the collection of addresses of Serge Glasfeld, but it's difficult to utilize it because it's not, the origin of the address is not clear. At some points, it's a declared, as I said shortly, but I was very short about it. Some addresses are addresses of arrest by the police, by the French police. Some addresses are address declared. We have a colleague which is working on roundups and arrest, and we are trying to map this on. But we find special strategies, and it's very interesting because you find some people arrested at hidden places, but they declare the previous address. You know, it's you can then enter the strategies of the police, of the arrested, but we have to do it. It's difficult because we need many records to do that. But I think it's possible on a sample at least. Yes, the fact that many new tenants came from the suburbs probably means they didn't know. They had no connection. The prefecture made lists of empty apartments and then gave them to these bombed families, and they went to visit. They queued up, they lined up in the street to visit the apartments and so on. But at some point also there are many, and we can then go deeper in the analysis with other kind of correspondence, because then you understand, okay, he was living far away, but he was working close nearby, and where we have to measure this vicinity with various indexes probably, but there are still half of them, and the other half are probably had been living closely. So these would be the two main categories of new interdependence. We identify the bombing victims and the neighbors, and I think we can, there are possibilities to think about that, and even in a quantitative manner, because we have many levels of addresses. On the street level, of course, I think also from many letters of the applicants to these looted apartments, we see that they knew about the looting and the empty apartment because they see that there's no light anymore because they're living in the front building, and it's complicated at some point because it also sometimes connects to families in hiding. So they put the light out, but they're still living in. And we identify many cases of such cases because a neighbor says, I think this apartment is empty. And then the prefecture makes an investigation, and it finds out that the Jewish family is still living in. They just didn't light the apartment in the evening. So there are probably many possibilities to think about this visual and to connect it to the sources even.
Thank you, Eric. So when I think about comparisons, so a lot of what you said resonated with me because of what I did on research in Berlin, where you also have, let's say, applicants for these the evacuated apartments. But you have also special categories, and I wonder if this might be true because the same is true for Prague. My recent work on Prague, I found that, for example, Germans were privileged in getting into these apartments. And sometimes the standard of the apartment was also important, who gets it. The better apartments went to a certain, let's say, strata of people, whether Germans or Germans working for special institutions rather than every German. And the similar is true for Berlin. So I wonder, can you say something about Paris in this regard? And I think in general, as a pattern, the influence of the drive of people towards these apartments is not to underestimate, and I think we still do this. And I wondered a little bit that you used the term bystander, because I think it's totally obsolete. Yeah, because it's really, especially when you talk about it like this, it's all about the relationships and what people want and their personal interests.
Yeah, thank you. I use the word bystander in a provocative manner as well. Also to outline that there are so many people who moved in, and this is far much than, small collaborators, or this is a huge amount of people. Yes, I'm very interested into comparison, and it's very difficult to do because if you don't see the archives, it's very difficult to talk about it. I had a look in Berlin at some archives, and of what I've read on Berlin and Prague, I don't know. But I have the impression of a main difference between Paris and Berlin in this matter is the kind of collaboration between the prefecture and the Germans, the German occupation authorities, but also a kind of huge autonomy of the French administration, which could at some point quite more put in the social dimension, and this kind of, many people get recommendations and get in because they were working for the Germans and so on, but a huge amount of people are workers. I had the impression the share in the general number of beneficiaries was quite much higher than in Berlin, for example, where I had the impression that many more civil servants get into it, and in Paris quite less, well, many as well. Many people working at the prefecture, it's clear, or for the police get an apartment, that's sure. But not so many. I had the impression there's a kind of more social dimension, which probably was a huge problem after the war, because during this kind of social dimension was probably put in during the trials for the retrieval, and I think it's a big issue. Maybe that would be a kind of major difference between occupied and German territories, but I don't know yet. And I have the impression it's very difficult to compare because we really need to get into the files. But I would be happy. Well, it's a general call. We're looking for people dealing with such matters in other cities. So if you know about them, we're looking for them.
I want to kind of ask again the question that you asked earlier about reparations. And it strikes me, I never really thought very much about this, but it strikes me that mapping or even digital technologies it's probably too late for the Holocaust. You showed a picture of Thessaloniki, the movie, or Cambodia, the buildings, etc. It's probably too late for that. But I think these digital technology, mapping technology, have a great potential for reparation, especially if they're used for contemporary genocides. I think the closer you are to the event, the more able you are to document it. I think it is a great potential, and I hadn't thought about it, but I think it's good.
So thank you very much for our speakers. And thank you very much for your questions.
Now we have a 20-minute coffee break, and then the final panel.